Welcome back to the Complete History of Coffee, episode 27, Coffee in Africa. Grab your favorite caffeinated beverage and let's get started. Okay, we are doing an Ethiopian coffee ceremony today. I would have loved to have started the series with one of these, but there wasn't exactly a whole lot in New Mexico. Now that I live 5 minutes away from little Ethiopia in LA, we are going to be trying one today. Okay, right off the bat, it's a cute, tiny little cup. Let's give it a smell. It's got a bit of an herbally profile, getting a little bit of fruits, almost like berries. It's pretty smooth, citrusy notes. What are you getting from it?
So I definitely smell more chocolatey. I smell like the chocolatey and earthy. I don't really smell the berry as much of it though. Tasting? It is definitely a thicker, full-bodied, but I do not taste the chocolate anymore. I just taste the earthy. It's not bad.
Okay, let's go ahead and give it a try. Wow, that is a very full body coffee. Like it really just coats the entire mouth. Feels a little heavy. It's kind of bitter. It's not like extremely bitter, but there's a bit of a bitterness to it. I feel like I'm getting a little bit less of those berry notes and a little bit more of the like earthy notes, even a little bit of like chocolatey notes, though. It kind of gives me a little bit more of like a Latin America, Asia Pacific than I think I was expecting. You know, traditionally with African coffees, it's a little bit more floral notes. I get a little bit of that, but not so much of the berry. Let's jump into coffee in Africa. This podcast series is ad-free due to support from listeners like you. If you'd like to help support the show, then head over to Patreon and consider becoming a patron. For the price of a coffee a month, you can support this and other projects in this series. And as a thank you to Patreon members of the show, I will be giving out a free pound of Ethiopian coffee this episode. Before we jump into African coffee, let's take a second and catch up with the history of chocolate, as it will be coming up this episode. We talked in our History of Chocolate members episode about how cacao, the essential ingredient for chocolate, derives its name from the Nahuatl word cacahuatl. Cacao beans were highly valued by pre-colonial cultures, including the Mayans and Aztecs. But interestingly, it seems to have been an exclusively American crop until the arrival of the Europeans. Although we know the Polynesians obtained crops like sweet potatoes from South America, it seems they did not gain access to cacao. There are some who believe the Norse possibly accessed it, however, there is no conclusive evidence to support this. So then from current evidence, it was Hernan Cortés who first took cacao beans back to Spain in 1528. Chocolate spread across Europe, evolving into the candy we know today, though it remained an exclusive delicacy for the elite. By the 18th century, chocolate was being made into solid forms, and the mass production of chocolate began to take shape, especially after the Industrial Revolution. What's important for this episode, though, is how chocolate made its way to Africa. The journey begins with Tete Quirshi, a Ghanaian blacksmith, who introduced cacao seeds to Ghana, a country in West Africa. Quirshi had encountered cacao during his time in the Spanish colony of Fernando Po. Upon returning to Ghana in 1898, he planted the seeds with success. This began Africa's long history with chocolate, with Ghana going on to become one of the largest cacao producers in the world. The cacao industry was led by European colonial powers, forcing it to spread across Africa. The Ivory Coast and Nigeria were particularly important in the spread as cacao thrived in these countries. By the early 20th century, West Africa had emerged as the world's largest exporter. Later this episode, we will continue chocolate's journey in Africa after the revival of coffee takes place in the mid 20th century. Today, Western Africa is the heart of global cacao production. Approximately 70% of the world's cacao beans come from four key West African countries: Ivory Coast, Ghana, Nigeria, and Cameroon. Among these, the Ivory Coast and Ghana are the largest producers, with the two countries together accounting for more than 50% of the world's cacao supply. Now, let's get back into the story of coffee. We're back in Africa, the home of coffee. To start, let us get our bearing on where we are in coffee history. Jonathan Morris considers this period of the mid 20th century to be the beginning of coffee as a global commodity. I would argue it already was a global commodity before this point, but instant coffee and cheaper Robusta beans paved the way for people in poorer countries around the world to gain access to it more easily. This meant Africa could reclaim its place on the world stage as a significant coffee grower, a place it had not held since coffee was first taken to Yemen and monopolized centuries prior. Coffee leaf rust had devastated much of the Dutch East Indies, leading to Robusta beans being imported from Congo to become the primary crop by the 1930s. Of course, American roasters advertised these beans as being Java and Sumatra blends, missing the important part about Robusta beans. In any case, World War II caused Indonesian coffee to nearly disappear. In fact, it wasn't until the 1980s it would finally be revived. So Africa was the primary source of Robusta beans following the war. For over half a century, many of the economies of Latin America have been hit by fluctuating coffee prices, as supply and demand constantly shift back and forth. Such economic shifts led to revolution in Brazil and Guatemala, as well as the silent Holocaust during the said revolution in Guatemala of many of the Mayan indigenous population. It also led to socio-economic conflict in other countries, pushed some like Cuba to leave the bean completely, and resulted in the suicide of Vargas, as we mentioned at the end of last episode. So out of this latest collapse in the coffee market, we find Africa on the rise. See, African colonies were using Robusta beans, which were not only more resistant to leaf rust, but also grew faster and produced more coffee than Arabica coffee trees. The only problem is the lesser quality taste of Robusta beans. Like, they really do not taste good at all. So, historically, this meant no one really wanted to buy them, and the best case scenario, some may combine Robusta and Arabica together to help the taste. But the United States, following World War II, stopped caring about coffee quality, and so now there was suddenly a big new market for American Robusta beans in the ever-growing use of instant coffee. It also coincided with the Piranha Frost, which destroyed much of Brazil's coffee crops in 1955. So while Arabica trees take 4 years to grow, it only takes 2 years for Robusta, allowing for a replacement of the global coffee market. This decline in Arabica coffee led to an almost direct correlation between the decline in production of Latin American coffee in this period and the increase of sales from Africa. Roughly a 30% decline in increase, both respectively, from the start of the century until the 1970s. Part of this growing desire in Africa to export coffee was due to increased independence of colonies. Keep in mind, the European powers had divided up much of Africa during the Berlin Conference of the mid-1880s. Following World War II, many colonies were slowly granted independence by Western European powers, as they had less ability to enforce their will over colonial territories. The US started the process of decolonization in the Philippines in 1946. The following year, India gained independence from Britain under the guidance of Mohandas Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru. These events sparked a desire by African colonies to push for independence. Libya and Egypt both gained independence from England in 1951 and 52, respectively. While Libya was granted its independence peacefully in 1951 and Egypt's independence was through a military coup, Kenya was not given its freedom so easily. Kenya would not gain its independence until the end of 1963, and the people of Kenya weren't given access to the coffee they grew until 2002, due to the high demand on the country for exporting. Like many former English colonies, Kenya had marketing boards which oversaw coffee processing and exporting. This system gave the government money from proceeds made on coffee exports. This allowed the state to reward plantations who grew higher grade coffee by buying their supply for more money. While still a colony of Britain, Kenya began producing a different variety of Arabica coffee, bourbon. Remember, there are different types of coffee, like Arabica and Robusta, and then within those, there are varietals. So while most were using Typica, or we could say typically using Typica, Kenya was now using bourbon. This varietal was from Ethiopia and was most famously produced by Karen Blixen. African coffees are, of course, known for their floral and fruity notes, and bourbon coffee specifically gave Kenya a jammy blackberry flavor profile. The English were pretty hard on indigenous Kenyans, however, enforcing rough working conditions, such as forcing them to step into coffee fermenting containers to break up the mucilage off the coffee. In response, some would sabotage coffee stores, but by 1952, many hit their breaking point. That year, the Mau Mau uprising took place. The government suppressed and arrested the rebels, even implementing detention camps, which held 150,000 people by the end of 1954. After the rebellion, England began loosening up its dominance over the coffee industry in Kenya. In 1960, reforms were passed to encourage agriculture, namely coffee. For the rest of the decade, they would slowly gain control of the coffee industry in their own country. After they gained independence in 1963, the Coffee Board encouraged higher grade coffee, buying it at higher price points. This was not the case for all former British colonies, however, as Tanzania's coffee board cared little for their coffee quality and lost their reputation in the world market. Let us look at some of the other major players in Africa. We find the Ivory Coast was a significant grower as well. It was in 1960 the Ivory Coast gained its first president, Felix Houphouët-Boigny. He was a former coffee grower, and as such pushed for many reforms to remove old colonial privileges given to French plantation owners. He then pushed those native to the country to enter the coffee industry. This led to a boom in coffee production, and by 1970, the country was the third largest producer of coffee in the world. The state regulated the coffee industry, ensuring fair prices, which ironically was created from the French Stabilization Fund, which formerly protected coffee growers. This encouraged new plantations to form, as many felt protected since this meant guaranteed prices on coffee. This system was more or less present in other Franco-African countries, but became corrupt in many other countries. Looking at Uganda, we find them increasing sales of Robusta on the global market. Shortly after World War II, they were producing 31,000 tons of coffee a year. But by the time of their independence in 1962, this number would grow to 119,000. By the end of the decade, that number would go on to more than double. Much of this coffee was grown by small farms. The 1970s saw a decline in coffee, though, as the military dictator Idi Amin took control of the country. He is known as one of the most cruel dictators in modern history, and as such, many in America wanted a trade embargo on Uganda. See, 90% of the country's revenue from exports was from coffee, which essentially meant coffee was fueling Amin's reign of terror. While the boycott was passed by Congress, it was not approved by President Carter. However, American coffee companies largely decided to stop buying Ugandan coffee anyway, leading to a massive decline in the country's coffee exports. Even after Amin was overthrown, they were still politically unstable, and the Coffee Marketing Board became corrupt, holding on to 80% of the profits from coffee exports. Taking a little trip over to Ethiopia, we find the country producing the majority of Arabica coffee out of Africa. Quite fitting, Ethiopia was growing higher grade coffee, as it is, after all, the recognized origin place of all coffee. And in fact, much of the coffee there was still wild. There were some coffee plantations, but much of the coffee was simply harvested from wild trees in Kaffa. As such, coffee from Ethiopia could vary wildly in quality. During the mid 1950s, Ethiopia was exporting around 3 times as much coffee as Kenya, but these countries were well behind the larger coffee producing countries in Africa during this period. Angola exported over 1 million bags of coffee in 1954. In the following year, the Ivory Coast surpassed them, producing 1.4 million bags. Up until this point, cacao had been Africa's primary export, but for the first time during this period, coffee became the continent's largest export. This leads us to pick up where we left off with the story of chocolate in Africa. After coffee production took off in the mid 20th century in Africa, we might assume chocolate would be phased out, but actually the two went on to be grown side by side in many African farms. This was especially beneficial in case one crop failed or saw a sudden fall in the global market. For many countries, though, cacao actually continued to be a larger crop than coffee, such as the Ivory Coast and Ghana. With many African countries gaining independence at this time, cacao filled the role of an important national crop. As such, coffee and chocolate came together to economically support many African countries. Uganda, Tanganyika, Madagascar, and Congo were all large producers of Robusta beans. But they had competition from Asia, where India, Indonesia, and Vietnam were also producing Robusta beans, albeit at a small amount. Let's travel over to Latin America to see what's going on with coffee at this time. We find the region in stark contrast, with the coffee market failing. If you remember, we mentioned last episode Vargas had taken his life in 1954, as Brazil faced yet another collapse of the coffee market. But the following year saw a continued drop in the coffee prices for all of Latin America, which led many in the region to worry. Several U.S. banks loaned $200 million to Brazil, but much like before the Depression, this was not enough to hold back the 9 million bags of coffee Brazil was storing as prices continued plummeting. American coffee roasters took advantage of the situation by allowing their stocks to run to depletion as they anticipated a further drop in coffee prices. Colombia, for its part, tried to convince other Latin American countries to hold back their coffee supply to help the market from dropping further. Most Latin American countries agreed to hold back exports. Around the same time in 1956, there was a report from the Economic and Social Council of the Organization of American States, which predicted a collapse of the coffee market if each country did not implement set quotas and stockpile their own coffee. The report was supported by Harold Randall, representative on the organization from the U.S. State Department. His actions were a clear sign of American support for Latin America's economy. American foreign policy during the Cold War sought to prevent political and economic turmoil in the region as to curb the tide of communism. But between the frost in Brazil and the flood in Colombia, which both destroyed coffee crops that year, the U.S. State Department ultimately held back its support. The following year, 1957, looked bleak for Brazil, as they were on track to rack up over $1 billion in debt if they kept on this current track. So a conference was held in Mexico City between Brazil and a few other Latin American countries to establish an export quota. A few months later, the United States sent over someone to observe a similar conference at Rio de Janeiro. This meeting, however, was joined by African coffee growers. It resulted in the 1958 Latin American Coffee Agreement, which essentially meant working together to encourage global coffee consumption. African countries, however, did not agree to limit coffee exports, but Brazil held back 40%, Colombia 15%, and other Latin American countries also held back a percentage of their coffee. To help ensure good relations between the U.S. and South America during the Cold War era, Nixon decided to go on a goodwill tour of the continent in the hopes of preventing them from leaning towards the side of Russian communism. But unfortunately for him, his visit was not so well received by many in the region. Peru and Venezuela saw people boo the president as well as spit at him, throw stones, and call for his death. So this opened Nixon's eyes to the situation and led the U.S. State Department to begin working with Latin American ambassadors to figure out a better solution to their coffee problems. Andres Uribe, representative of Colombia's National Coffee Growing Association and chairman of the Pan American Coffee Bureau, warned the U.S. not to allow an economic downturn as this could lead governments in the region to be toppled and ally themselves with the Soviet Union. One may wonder where all this Robusta was going, now that Latin American Arabica was in decline. Obviously, we've been talking previously about instant coffee taking over the market in America, but what about whole bean coffee? New brands emerged with Robusta beans that saw price cuts of up to 30 cents below the major brands. So, to compete in the price war, big brands began to slowly integrate Robusta into their blends to cut costs. General Foods did so quietly, adding Robusta into Maxwell House, which led the rest of the big five brands, Folgers, Standard Brands, Hills Brothers, and Atlantic and Pacific, to follow suit. By 1956, Robusta accounted for 22% of global coffee exports. One coffee expert of the time stated, quote, "One hesitates to speak of these poor coffees as blends," end quote. By 1960, the New York Coffee and Sugar Exchange repealed its ban on Robusta beans. At the end of World War II, there were over 1,000 roasters in the U.S., but by this point, the market had forced many companies to go under or buy each other out. The big five brands at this time accounted for 40% of the coffee market, and there were only 850 roasters operating. The introduction of mechanization helped some keep up by increasing their efficiency and speed. But even so, the market was simply headed in the direction of cheaper goods. Many stores were seeing price cuts, including A&P and Jewel Tea Company. A&P, unfortunately, did not keep up with this changing market and saw their average sales at around $4,000 less a week than their competitors, Kroger, Safeway, First National, and Jewel Tea Company. Even though they own 1/3 of all chain stores in the U.S., it didn't help that the mid-50s saw General Foods surpass them to become the largest coffee importer in the country. And of course, during this dark age of coffee, we find instant coffee utilizing more and more Robusta. By 1958, most instant brands used at least 50% Robusta, if not 100%. But to make matters worse, they went from using 6 pounds of ground coffee beans to make a single pound of instant coffee down to 4 pounds of green coffee. They did this by over-extracting every soluble part of the coffee. To make the coffee more appealing to consumers, they used the leftover oils from the instant coffee making process and added them back in to give it a fresh roasted smell. However, that's all it was, a brief smell of freshness from the container when it was opened, as it did not help with the taste. The other issue with instant coffee is how fast it goes bad once it's opened. One might think fresh coffee from the vending machine would be a better choice, but they too had switched over to Robusta beans. It makes you wonder why no one was trying to push for higher quality coffee, even if it meant a more expensive cup of coffee. Well, that's exactly what one man in New York, William Black, considered. William started as a nut vendor in the 20s, expanding into a chain of stores called Chock Full of Nuts. However, he was forced to adapt during the Depression as nuts became a bit of a luxury good. So he expanded his stores into luncheonettes. Luncheonettes were essentially informal restaurants which served lunch food, and in William's case, coffee. By the early 1950s, he was operating 25 restaurant locations in New York as coffee prices and quality were hitting their decline. He tried to compete with others by continuing to use better quality coffee and was simply watering it down so he could match the 5-cent cup of coffee. However, he quickly refused to serve subpar coffee and decided to stick to freshness and quality over competing with lower prices. Against all odds, he launched a successful new brand of high-quality coffee in 1953. Really, it was against all odds, as others in the coffee market felt Chock Full of Nuts was a weird name for a coffee brand, and apparently the can it came in wasn't very aesthetically pleasing. What's funny is the can they originally used was yellow and black, and even to this day they still use the same colors, just with the New York skyline on the modern cans. The other concern was he marketed the coffee as an all-method grind, in contrast to other brands who offered coffee ground for different coffee makers. So it truly was his quality over cheaper deals that won him the day, well, and good advertising. He ran radio ads with his wife, Jean Martin, who would sing,
"Chock full of nuts is that heavenly coffee, heavenly coffee. Chock full of nuts is that heavenly coffee."
"Better coffee Rockefeller's money can't buy." Nelson Rockefeller actually sued William Black for using his name in the jingle, so his name was replaced with
Better coffee a millionaire's money can't buy.
By 1954, the brand was the third largest in New York. He ran ads which were counterintuitive, like, "Don't spend the extra money for this coffee unless you're just plain crazy about coffee." This same strategy would go on to serve Wilkins Coffee well in the late 50s, when they ran their own counterintuitive television ads featuring the puppeteer Jim Henson. One of the puppets, Wilkins, would beat the puppet Watkins up, or even full-on blow him up for not having Wilkins coffee. One ad went like this. Wilkins asked, "Have you some Wilkins coffee?" Watkins hesitantly responds, "Well, I... So Wilkins hits him over the head a couple times, and Watkins decides to take some, saying, "Surprising how many are switching over to Wilkins coffee." Just like with Wilkins, Chock Full of Nuts saw great success with such ads. Chock Full also utilized coffee ads which were reminiscent of older coffee ads. They had a woman with a cup of coffee pouring down her head, stating, quote, "Men, don't let it come to this. Win your fight for a decent cup of coffee without losing your temper," end quote. William Black ran his restaurant very hands-on. From keeping each location spotless to not allowing tips, he had a clear image for his brand, and it worked well for him. This definitely translated into coffee, as even when the company launched its instant coffee brand, he was reportedly disappointed about entering the instant coffee market, but stated, quote, "This very finest instant coffee is still a far cry from our regular coffee. Yet there are a lot of people who don't like it. End quote. Chock-full expanded across the northeastern United States and even into Canada. This period of the mid-1950s was the start of the civil rights movement, which would explode across the U.S. over the next decade. William Black was an early advocate for the movement, with half of his company's employees being black, and even hiring Jackie Robinson as personnel director in 1957. That same year, one of his friends contracted Parkinson's disease, leading him to donate $100,000 to a foundation working to fight the disease. In 1958, he opened the company to the stock market and keeping a majority of the shares for himself to retain control. So 2 years later, with his rising wealth, he donated $5 million to Columbia University for a medical research building. He was one of the early millionaires to push for the wealthy to donate their money towards beneficial causes. So, in a way, coffee helped pave the way for modern philanthropy. Next episode, we will catch up with post-war Europe and see what's been happening over there as we leave the dark ages of coffee and enter the age of espresso. This show is written and produced by me, Era Zaffer. If you have not already, please consider supporting this podcast series on Patreon. For the price of a latte a month, you can support this and future projects in this series while getting access to members' episodes, access to transcripts of the show, and a chance to win merch. Speaking of merch, don't forget to pick up a new shirt, hoodie, or mug from our merch site to support your favorite podcast series on coffee history. Make sure to join our community on social media at the Complete History Podcast Series. If you would like to contact us, you can message us through social media or at our email, completehistorypod@gmail.com. Don't forget to subscribe on whatever platform you listen to this podcast on, and make sure to share it with your family and friends. To close, here is an Ethiopian proverb. Coffee and love taste best when hot.